The door shouldn't even be there. That's what Sergeant Warren Holloway thinks as he stands in the half-destroyed administrative building, watching dust particles dance in the afternoon light. The Imperial Japanese forces pulled out of this sector 3 weeks ago, leaving behind scorched documents, broken radios, and the kind of eerie silence that makes every footstep sound like a confession. His unit has been sweeping through abandoned positions for days now, and they've found plenty. Weapons caches, intelligence maps, sometimes bodies. But this door, this heavy iron door set flush into the concrete floor of what used to be a communications room, this is different. It has a lock, a new lock. And when Private Marvin Caldwell kneels down and presses his ear against the cold metal, he hears something that makes his 19-year-old face go pale. Breathing. Faint, irregular, but unmistakably human breathing coming from below. Warren has been in the Pacific for 2 years. He's seen men die in ways that would make folks back in Nebraska stop eating for a week. He's learned that the enemy fights with a fanaticism that seems almost inhuman, that surrender is rarer than rain in August, that every cave and bunker could be a trap. The propaganda posters show Japanese soldiers as buck-toothed monsters. And after Guadalcanal, after Tarawa, after watching his friends torn apart by banzai charges, part of him believed it. But standing here, looking at this locked door, something feels wrong. Not dangerous wrong. Sad wrong. He signals to Marvin and 2 other men. They position their rifles. Warren grips the iron handle, counts to 3 in his head, and pulls. The smell hits first. Human waste, sweat, something sour and desperate that makes Marvin gag and turn away. Then the sound, a collective gasp, like the basement itself just inhaled for the first time in forever. Warren's eyes need a moment to adjust because down there, maybe 12 feet below, it's almost completely dark. The only light comes from the door they just opened. A harsh rectangle of yellow sun that cuts through the blackness like a knife. And in that light, pressed against the far wall, are 7 women. Japanese women. Their faces are skeletal, eyes swollen and red, clothes hanging off bodies that look like they've been wrung dry. One of them raises a hand to shield her face from the light, and Warren sees her arm shaking so badly, it's like she's trying to wave goodbye to her own life. Nobody moves. Not the Americans above. Not the women below. For a long, impossible moment, the war just stops. Fusei Tanaka was 24 years old when they locked the door. She's a nurse, trained in Osaka, assigned to a field hospital unit that followed the Imperial Army as it retreated island by island, defeat by defeat. She remembers the morning it happened with the kind of clarity that trauma burns into memory. Captain Ishida gathered all the women, 7 of them, nurses, a telephonist, a cook, an administrator, and told them the Americans were less than a day away. He said the men would evacuate first, establish a new defensive line, and then send transport back for the women. He said it with the kind of voice that makes you want to believe, even when you know better. He told them to wait in the basement storage room, that it was the safest place, that the concrete walls would protect them from shelling. Then he looked at them one more time, and Fusei saw something in his eyes that made her stomach turn. Not cruelty. Resignation. Like he was already apologizing for something he hadn't done yet. They went down. All 7 of them. The room was maybe 15 feet by 20, with wooden crates stacked against one wall and a single bucket in the corner. There were no windows. The only light came from the doorway at the top of the stairs. Masako Sato, the telephonist, 21 years old with a smile that could make even the grimmest officer soften, tried to make a joke about it. She said at least they wouldn't get sunburned. Fumiko Yamamoto, the cook, 28, and built like someone who'd spent a lifetime lifting iron pots, started organizing the space immediately, checking the crates for food or water. Akiko Endo, the youngest and smallest, sat down on the floor and hugged her knees. Fusei watched Captain Ishida's boots disappear up the stairs. She heard the door close. Then she heard the lock click. That sound, that tiny metallic click, that's the sound that plays in her head every night for the rest of her life. The first day wasn't so bad. They had a little water in canteens, some rice balls Fumiko had stashed in her bag. They rationed carefully. Masako kept talking, filling the silence with stories about her family in Kyoto, about the boy she liked before the war, about the cherry blossoms she wanted to see again. Fusei checked everyone's physical condition, made mental notes, tried to stay clinical. Akiko cried quietly in the corner, and Fumiko sat next to her, not saying anything, just being there. They told themselves it would be a day, maybe two. The army wouldn't abandon them. Captain Ishida gave his word. But as the hours passed and the darkness pressed in, a different kind of understanding started to settle over them. They weren't waiting to be rescued. They were waiting to see if anyone remembered they existed. The basement had no sense of time. Without windows, without light, the hours blurred together into one long, suffocating present. Fusée tried to keep track by counting her breaths, by marking scratches on the wall with a nail she found. But eventually even that discipline fell apart. Was it morning? Was it night? Had it been 12 hours or 20? The disorientation was almost worse than the thirst, because it made them feel like they were floating in some void outside of reality, like they'd already died and this was just the waiting room before whatever came next. Masako started singing softly, old folk songs their mothers used to sing, and for a while, it helped. But her voice grew weaker with each passing hour, and eventually she stopped altogether, conserving what little energy she had left. By the third day, the water was gone. Fusée tried to keep everyone calm, but thirst is a kind of suffering that doesn't care about discipline or training. It starts as discomfort, then becomes pain, then transforms into an obsession that drowns out every other thought. Masako stopped talking. Akiko stopped crying. They all just sat there in the dark, listening to each other's breathing, feeling their tongues swell and their lips crack. Fumiko tried to keep them moving, insisted they stand up every few hours, stretch, keep the blood flowing. But it got harder. The air was thick and stale, and every breath felt like it was stealing oxygen from someone else. On the fourth day, Akiko collapsed. Fusée caught her before she hit the ground, felt how light she'd become, how her skin was hot and dry like paper about to burn. She laid her down gently, whispered that help was coming, and hoped Akiko was too delirious to hear the lie. Fusée had trained for years to be a nurse. She knew anatomy, physiology, how to treat wounds and infections and shock, but nothing in her training prepared her for this, for watching people die slowly from deprivation, for being unable to do anything except bear witness. She checked pulses, monitored breathing, made mental calculations about how long each of them had left. Akiko was the weakest, maybe 3 more days at most. Masako was stronger, but her spirit was breaking, and Fusée knew that sometimes the will to live mattered more than physical reserves. Fumiko was holding on through sheer stubbornness, but even she was starting to fade. And Fusée herself, she could feel her own body shutting down, systems prioritizing survival over everything else. Her periods had stopped. Her hair was falling out in clumps. Her thoughts were getting fuzzy around the edges, like someone had smudged the boundaries between reality and dream. On the 5th day, they stopped talking altogether. Speaking required moisture they didn't have, energy they couldn't spare. They communicated through touch, a hand on a shoulder, fingers intertwined in the dark. Fusée found herself thinking about her childhood, about summers in the countryside, about jumping into cold rivers and drinking until her stomach hurt. The memories were so vivid she could taste the water, feel it running down her throat, and for a moment the relief was so intense it felt real. Then she opened her eyes and remembered where she was, and the crash back into reality was like falling off a cliff. She wondered if this was how it would end, lost in hallucinations, her mind retreating into fantasy, because the present was too unbearable to face. Fumiko was the one who kept them anchored. Even as her own strength failed, she maintained a routine, insisted they move every few hours, made them promise to keep fighting. She told stories in the dark, not with words anymore, but with gentle touches, patterns tapped on arms and backs, a kind of Morse code of comfort. She was the oldest, the one who'd seen the most, survived the most, and she refused to let them give up. When Akiko's breathing became shallow and irregular, Fumiko held her, rocked her like a child, hummed tunes that no one could hear but everyone could feel through the vibrations of her chest. It was Fumiko who reminded them that they were still human, still connected, still worth saving even if no one was coming to save them. Warren Holloway grew up on a farm outside of Lincoln, Nebraska. He knows what it means to work until your hands bleed, to watch a crop fail and have to smile through it, to understand that life doesn't owe you fairness. He enlisted 3 days after Pearl Harbor, Not because he hated the Japanese, but because it seemed like the right thing to do. His mother cried. His father shook his hand and told him to come back with his honor intact. Warren didn't really know what that meant until he saw his first combat, until he watched a kid from Iowa take a bullet in the throat and spend his last 30 seconds on Earth trying to say his girlfriend's name. After that, honor seemed like a word people used when they didn't want to say murder. But he kept fighting because stopping didn't seem like an option, because the men next to him depended on it, because going home without finishing felt like betraying everyone who didn't get to go home at all. He'd been through POW, where the Japanese defenders turned the island into a fortress of coral caves and hidden pillboxes, where every yard of ground cost American lives in numbers that made the generals back in Hawaii revise their estimates 3 times. He'd seen kamikaze pilots crash into ships, watched men burn alive in their gun turrets, pulled bodies out of wreckage that didn't look like bodies anymore. He'd learned to hate, not because he wanted to, but because hate was easier than grief, easier than acknowledging that the men trying to kill him were just as scared and far from home as he was. The propaganda made it simple, turned the enemy into something less than human, and Warren let himself believe it because the alternative was looking at every Japanese soldier and seeing someone's son, someone's brother, someone who probably didn't want to be there any more than he did. Now he's staring down into a basement at 7 women who look like they've been buried alive, and every piece of propaganda he's ever seen dissolves in his mind like sugar in rain. These aren't monsters. They're not fanatics. They're human beings who've been left to die in the dark, and the fact that they're Japanese doesn't make it any less horrifying. He turns to Marvin, who's still pale and looks like he might vomit, and says, "Get the medic, get water, get blankets, move." Marvin runs. Warren kneels at the edge of the opening, and in the best Japanese he can manage, a language he learned from a phrase book and a Nisei translator who died on Saipan, he says, "You're safe now. We're Americans. We're here to help." One of the women, the one who looks the oldest, stares up at him with eyes that don't seem to register the words. She just keeps staring, like she's trying to figure out if he's real or if her mind has finally broken completely. Fusai hears the voice speaking Japanese, and for a moment she thinks she's hallucinating. 10 days in the dark does things to the mind. She's heard Masako talking to people who aren't there. She's felt her own thoughts spiral into strange loops where time stops making sense. But then the voice comes again, and she realizes it's real, and it's speaking with an American accent, clumsy and mispronounced but unmistakably trying to communicate. She looks up at the rectangle of light at the silhouette of a man in an American uniform, and her brain struggles to process the contradiction. The enemy, the monsters from the propaganda, the men they were told would torture and kill them if captured, and he's offering help. She tries to stand, but her legs won't cooperate. She's been sitting for so long, dehydrated for so long, that her body has forgotten how to obey. Fumiko grabs her arm, steadies her, and together they manage to get upright. Fusai's voice comes out as a croak, barely a whisper, but she forces the words out in English, a language she learned in school a lifetime ago. "Please, water," she says, and hates how desperate she sounds, how small. The medic arrives with canteens and blankets, and Warren's men rig a rope to help pull the women up one by one. They move slowly, carefully, because these women are so weak that a wrong move could break something. Marvin goes down first, and when he reaches the bottom, the smell almost knocks him over. He's never seen people this close to death who were still breathing. The youngest one, Akiko, can't even stand. He lifts her, shocked at how little she weighs, and passes her up to the men above. She's conscious, barely, and when she looks at him, there's no fear in her eyes. Just exhaustion, just relief, just a desperate gratitude that makes Marvin's throat tighten and his eyes sting. One by one, they bring the women into the light. Fusai is the last to come up. When she reaches the top and steps onto solid ground, the sunlight is so bright it feels like violence. She closes her eyes, sways, and Warren catches her before she falls. For a moment, they're just 2 people, one holding the other up, and the war doesn't matter. They set up a makeshift aid station in the shade of the building. The medic, a skinny kid from Tennessee named Peters, works fast, checking vitals, administering water in tiny sips because too much too fast will make them vomit. Fusai watches him work, sees the concentration on his face, the way his hands move with practiced efficiency, and realizes he's just like her. a medical professional trying to save lives in the middle of a nightmare. She wants to thank him, but her throat is too dry, her English too rusty. Instead, she just nods when he looks at her and he nods back, and somehow that's enough. Masako starts crying, not sad crying, but the kind of crying that happens when your body finally believes it's allowed to feel again. Fumiko holds her, strokes her hair, and whispers that they're alive, they made it, it's over. But Fusai knows it's not over. Not really. The war is still happening. They're still prisoners. And the fact that these Americans are kind doesn't erase the fact that 10 days ago, her own people locked her in a basement to die. Warren watches the women recover, sees color slowly return to their faces, sees them drink water like it's the most precious thing in the world. He thinks about Captain Ishida, the man who locked them down there. He wonders what kind of orders that man was following, what kind of impossible choice he faced. Evacuate the fighting men and leave the women behind, or slow down the retreat and risk everyone. It's the kind of decision that war forces on people, the kind that turns human beings into monsters not because they're evil, but because every option is terrible. Warren's been in command long enough to know that feeling, the weight of choosing who lives and who doesn't. He doesn't hate Captain Ishida. He just feels tired of the whole damn thing. Marvin sits next to Akiko, who's wrapped in a blanket and sipping water with shaking hands. She's so young, maybe younger than him, and he can't stop thinking about how close she came to dying in that basement. He remembers the recruiting posters, the ones that made war look like an adventure, like something noble and clean. He remembers believing it. Now he knows better. War isn't noble, it's just people hurting each other until someone decides to stop. He looks at Akiko, and she looks back at him, and neither of them speaks because they don't share a language, but they don't need to. The look says everything. I see you. I'm sorry. I'm glad you're alive. Peters finishes his examination and pulls Warren aside. They're in bad shape, he says quietly. Severe dehydration, malnutrition, possible kidney damage. The youngest one, Akiko, she might not make it. Her organs are shutting down. Warren nods, asks what they need. Peters lists supplies, most of which they don't have, and says the best thing would be to get them to a field hospital as soon as possible. Warren makes the call on the radio, requests evacuation for 7 enemy POWs, medical emergency. The voice on the other end hesitates, asks if they're combatants. Warren looks over at the women, at Fusei, who's now helping Peters tend to the others despite barely being able to stand herself, and says negative, non-combatants, nurses and support staff. The voice says transport will arrive in 4 hours. Warren says make it 2. While they wait, Fusei does what she's trained to do. She helps. Even though her hands shake and her vision blurs, even though every movement feels like lifting a mountain, she checks on each woman, assesses their condition, communicates with Peters through a mixture of broken English and hand gestures. There's a language that medical professionals share that transcends words, a way of understanding priorities and procedures that doesn't need translation. Peters is impressed by her composure and competence, and he makes a point of treating her not as a prisoner but as a colleague. He asks her opinion, defers to her knowledge of the patients, includes her in decisions. It's a small thing, but for Fusei, who's spent 10 days being treated as disposable, it's everything. Fumiko sits with Masako and the others, and for the first time in what feels like forever, she allows herself to relax. Not completely, because she's still weak and scared and uncertain about what comes next, but enough to feel the warmth of the sun on her face, to hear birds singing somewhere in the distance, to remember that the world still exists beyond concrete walls and locked doors. She thinks about her family, wonders if they know she's alive, if they think she died in the retreat. She thinks about the meals she used to cook, the simple pleasure of feeding people, making them happy with something as basic as warm rice and miso soup. She promises herself that if she survives this, if she makes it home, she'll never take those simple things for granted again. Masako's mind is still foggy, still struggling to separate reality from the hallucinations that plagued her in the dark. She keeps expecting the light to disappear, for the door to close again, for this rescue to reveal itself as just another cruel dream. But the water is real. The blanket is real. The American soldiers moving around the camp are real. She watches them, these men who were supposed to be her enemy, and tries to reconcile what she was taught with what she's experiencing. They're gentle with her. They speak softly. When one of them offers her a piece of chocolate, She takes it with trembling hands and tastes sweetness for the first time in weeks. It's such a small gesture, but it breaks something inside her, some wall she'd built to protect herself from hope. She cries again, and this time Fumiko doesn't need to comfort her because one of the American soldiers, a boy who can't be more than 20, sits down next to her and just stays there, a silent presence that says you're not alone. Akiko drifts in and out of consciousness. She's aware of voices, of hands touching her, checking her pulse, adjusting her blanket. She's aware of sunlight, warm and bright, so different from the cold darkness of the basement. She's aware that she's dying, can feel her body giving up, systems shutting down one by one. But she's not afraid. Not anymore. She spent 10 days being afraid, and now she's just tired. If this is the end, at least it's happening in the light, with people around her who care, with someone holding her hand. Marvin holds her hand. He doesn't know why, doesn't know if it makes a difference, but it feels like the right thing to do. He talks to her in English, knows she probably doesn't understand, but talks anyway. He tells her about his home in Ohio, about his little sister who's about her age, about how he's going to write to his family and tell them about this, about her, about how brave she is. The transport arrives, a truck converted into a makeshift ambulance. They load the women carefully, and Warren assigns Marvin and 2 others to escort them to the field hospital. Before they leave, Fuse turns to Warren and says thank you in careful English. Warren doesn't know what to say. Your welcome feels inadequate, insufficient for what just happened. So he just nods and she nods back, and they understand each other perfectly. The truck drives away, leaving Warren and the rest of his unit to continue their sweep of the area. But something's changed. The men are quieter than usual, more thoughtful. They'd all seen the women, seen what abandonment and cruelty looked like. And it's harder now to think of the enemy as faceless, as other. It's harder to hate when you've seen suffering up close, when you've held someone's hand while they cried, when you've given water to someone dying of thirst and watched them look at you like you're a miracle. At the field hospital, doctors and nurses swarm the women, moving them to cots, starting IV lines, running tests. Fuse watches them work, feels the familiar rhythm of a medical facility, and something inside her settles. This is a place she understands, a place where the rules make sense. Save lives, reduce suffering, treat everyone with dignity. The doctors are American, but they work with the same intensity and care she'd expect from any medical professional. One of them, an older man with gray hair and kind eyes, examines her thoroughly and tells her through an interpreter that she's lucky to be alive. Fuse almost laughs. Lucky. 10 days in a basement, abandoned by her own army. Saved by the enemy. If that's luck, she's not sure she wants it. But she is alive. They all are, even Akiko, who stabilizes after 2 days of intensive care. It takes weeks for them to recover fully. Weeks of careful feeding and hydration, of treating infections and monitoring organ function. During that time, they're kept in a section of the hospital designated for POWs, guarded but treated well. The staff is professional, sometimes even friendly. Fuse learns more English, helps translate for the others, becomes a bridge between the Japanese women and the American medical personnel. She finds purpose in it, a way to contribute, to be useful rather than just a victim. Masako slowly comes back to herself. The fog lifts, the hallucinations stop, and she starts to engage with the world again. She's quieter than she used to be, less quick to smile, but there's a strength in her now that wasn't there before. She survived something that should have killed her, and that survival has changed her in ways she's still figuring out. She writes letters to her family, not knowing if they'll ever be delivered, but needing to put words to paper, to document what happened, to bear witness. Fumiko recovers her physical strength but struggles with guilt. She was supposed to take care of them, to keep them safe, and she failed. It doesn't matter that there was nothing she could have done, that she was as much a victim as the rest. In her mind, she should have been stronger, smarter, better. Fuse recognizes the signs, talks to her late at night when the others are sleeping, reminds her that survival isn't a competition, that they all did the best they could, that the blame belongs to the war, not to any of them. It helps. A little. Enough for Fumiko to start forgiving herself. Slowly. In small increments. Akiko is the slowest to recover, physically and emotionally. The damage to her organs was severe, and the doctors aren't sure she'll ever be fully healthy again. But she's young, and her body has a remarkable capacity to heal. More difficult is the psychological trauma, the nightmares that wake her up screaming, the panic attacks when she's in a room without windows, the way her heart races whenever she hears a door lock click. The hospital assigns her a psychiatrist, a woman named Dr. Morrison, who specializes in trauma. Through an interpreter, they work through what happened, slowly, carefully, building a framework for Akiko to process the experience without being consumed by it. It's hard work, painful work, but necessary. The war ends while they're still in the hospital. Japan surrenders, and the news spreads through the POW sections like wildfire. Some prisoners weep with relief, others are angry, feeling betrayed by their government's decision. Fusai feels numb. The war is over, which means she can go home, but home to what? A country in ruins, a family that might not have survived, a life that doesn't exist anymore. She's 24 years old, and she feels ancient, like she's lived 100 years in the span of a few months. She wonders if she'll ever feel young again, if the weight of what she's experienced will ever lift, or if this is just who she is now. They're repatriated in the fall, loaded onto a ship with hundreds of other Japanese POWs and sent back across the Pacific. The journey takes weeks, and Fusai spends most of it on deck, staring at the ocean, thinking about everything that's happened. She thinks about Captain Nishida, wonders if he survived, if he knows what happened to them, if he carries the guilt of that locked door. She thinks about Warren Holloway and Marvin Caldwell, about Peters, the medic and doctor, Morrison, the psychiatrist, about all the Americans who treated her with kindness when they had every reason not to. She thinks about the basement, about the darkness and the thirst and the certainty that she was going to die forgotten. And she thinks about the door opening, about the light flooding in, about the moment when everything changed. When the ship docks in Japan, Fusai steps onto land that feels foreign, even though it's home. The country is devastated, cities reduced to rubble, people hollow-eyed and desperate. She makes her way to Osaka, to the neighborhood where she grew up, and finds her family's house still standing, damaged but intact. Her mother opens the door, sees her, and collapses. They thought she was dead. The army sent a letter months ago, listing her as missing and presumed killed in action. Fusai holds her mother while she cries and feels nothing. The numbness is total, insulating her from joy and grief alike. It will take years before she feels anything again, before the ice inside her starts to thaw. She tries to go back to nursing, but she can't. The first time she enters a hospital, the smells and sounds trigger a panic attack so severe she passes out. She tries again and again, but it's no use. The profession she loved, the calling she trained for, it's been taken from her along with everything else. So she pivots, finds a new path, becomes a teacher. She's good at it, patient and kind, and the children respond to her even though she rarely smiles. She builds a life, piece by piece, marries a man who's also a veteran, who understands without needing explanations, who knows that some wounds never fully heal. Masako goes back to Kyoto, finds her family intact but changed. Her father died in the war, and her mother has aged 20 years in the span of 5. The boy she liked before the war is married to someone else, and Masako is surprised to find she doesn't care. Those feelings belong to a different person, a girl who doesn't exist anymore. She works as a secretary, lives a quiet life, never marries. She writes poetry in her spare time, verses about darkness and light, about locked doors and open skies, about the strange mercy of enemies. She never publishes them. They're just for her, a way of processing what can't be spoken aloud. Fumiko returns to cooking, opens a small restaurant in Tokyo that becomes known for its simple, honest food. She never talks about the war, never tells her customers that she spent 10 days locked in a basement waiting to die. But the people who eat her food sense something in it, a depth of gratitude, a reverence for ingredients and nourishment that goes beyond mere skill. She treats every meal like a gift because she knows what it's like to have nothing, to feel your body consume itself from the inside. She lives to be 87, and on her deathbed, surrounded by children and grandchildren, she finally tells the story. They listen in silence, and afterward they understand her in a way they never did before. Akiko struggles the most. The physical damage to her organs leaves her weak and prone to illness. The psychological damage is even worse. She can't hold a job, can't maintain relationships, can't function in a world that expects her to just move on and be normal. She spends years in and out of institutions, treated for depression and anxiety, and what would later be recognized as PTSD. But slowly, with help, she finds a way forward. She becomes an advocate for other survivors, works with organizations that support veterans and civilians traumatized by war. She finds purpose in helping others carry burdens she knows too well. She never fully heals, but she learns to live with the wounds, to build a life around them rather than despite them. Warren Holloway goes home to Nebraska, takes over his father's farm, marries his high school sweetheart. He has 3 children, works the land, becomes a pillar of the community. He never talks about the war. Not to his wife, not to his children, not to anyone. But every year, on the anniversary of the day he opened that basement door, he takes a day off work, drives out to a quiet spot by the river, and sits there for hours, thinking about 7 women he saved and the thousands of people he killed. He wonders if one balances out the other, if mercy counts for anything in the ledger of war. He never finds an answer that satisfies him. He just carries the question year after year, until he dies at 73 of a heart attack while plowing a field. Marvin Caldwell becomes a teacher, works with troubled kids in inner-city schools. He's good at it, has a way of connecting with students that other teachers envy. His secret is simple. He knows what it's like to see the worst of humanity and still choose kindness. He knows that small gestures matter, that holding someone's hand can be the difference between giving up and holding on. He tells his students about the war sometimes, not the glory parts, not the heroism, but the moment when he lifted a dying girl out of a basement and realized that the enemy was just people, scared and suffering and far from home. He tells them that the most important thing he learned in the war was that everyone deserves dignity, everyone deserves to be seen, everyone matters. His students remember those lessons long after they've forgotten algebra and grammar. Fusai Tanaka survives the war. So do Masako, Fumiko, and Akiko. They spend the rest of their lives carrying what happened in that basement, the weight of it never fully lifting but becoming, over time, bearable. They don't stay in touch. It's too hard, too painful to be reminded. But they think about each other often, wonder how the others are managing, hope they've found some measure of peace. On the 50th anniversary of the end of the war, a Japanese television station tracks them down, wants to do a documentary about their experience. They all decline. Some stories aren't meant to be entertainment. Some stories are too sacred, too raw, too personal to share with strangers. But Fusai, now 74 years old, agrees to write it down, not for publication, just for the record, so that someone, somewhere, knows what happened. She writes in careful longhand, filling notebook after notebook with details she's never spoken aloud. She writes about the darkness and the thirst and the certainty of death. She writes about the sound of the door opening, about the light that hurt her eyes, about the American soldier who caught her when she fell. She writes about the medic who treated her like a colleague, about the psychiatrist who helped her understand trauma, about all the small acts of kindness that saved her life as surely as the water and medical care. When she's finished, she seals the notebooks in a box and gives them to her daughter with instructions to donate them to a war museum after her death. She dies at 89, peacefully, in her sleep. Her daughter follows her instructions, and the notebooks end up in the archives of a museum in Tokyo, dedicated to preserving the stories of ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. A researcher finds them years later, reads them cover to cover in one sitting, and weeps. The story is eventually published, translated into multiple languages, used in schools to teach about the human cost of war. Fusai becomes posthumously what she never wanted to be in life, a symbol, a representative of all the forgotten people whose suffering doesn't make it into history books. But maybe that's okay. Maybe being remembered matters, even if it's uncomfortable, even if it's painful. Maybe the story of 7 women locked in a basement for 10 days, abandoned by their own army and saved by their enemy. Maybe that story needs to be told. Not to glorify war or condemn it, not to make heroes or villains, but simply to bear witness. To say that this happened, that these women existed, that their suffering was real, and their survival was a miracle, and the kindness they received from people they were taught to hate was a glimpse of what humanity could be, if we chose to see each other as human first and enemies second. The basement still exists. The building was torn down decades ago, replaced by a shopping mall, but the basement remains, buried under concrete and steel, a hidden scar in the earth. No one knows it's there except historians and researchers who've studied the maps. There's no plaque, no memorial, nothing to mark the spot where 7 women nearly died and were saved by the opening of a door. Maybe there should be. Maybe every place where suffering happened and mercy intervened deserves to be remembered. Or maybe it's enough that the story survives, passed down through words and memories, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, even when all hope seems lost, sometimes doors open, sometimes light floods in, sometimes the enemy becomes the savior, and sometimes, against all odds, people survive. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the human cost of conflict, about the people erased by history's broad strokes, then subscribe to this channel. We tell the stories that textbooks forget, the moments that reveal who we really are when everything else is stripped away. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts, hit the like button to help others find these stories, and remember that behind every statistic, every casualty number, every line on a map there were people who deserved to be remembered, people like Fuse, Masako, Fumiko, and Akiko, people like Warren and Marvin, people like you.